Hey everyone, today we're going to be going over the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, Chapter 1, Risk Management and Single Pilot Resource Management. Let's get right into it. Chapter 1 starts with a scenario that outlines the safety, it demonstrates the issues of complacency, safety risk management, risk assessment mitigation. It's a good intro to the chapter, but I'm not going to read it out. And then it jumps right into defining risk management. Defining risk management, it's a broad task, right? It can, there's a lot to the idea, the concept of risk, but the FAA defines 5 different types of risks. You have total risk, and total risk is just every single type of risk involved in a flight, seen, unseen, okay, not okay, and all that. So basically it's the sum of every single type of risk, right? You have identified risk. An identified risk is, risk that we've seen. This is through analysis techniques. This is, through the risk management process, which we'll get to. And then this process should not be something that we do, minutes before a flight. This is something that started days in advance. This is something we should be teaching a student to do days in advance. This looks like, asking them what the weather is going to be like the next day. Are we fit to fly? Everything like that. And so this is the process of identifying things that could go wrong with future flights. Next we have unidentified risks. And, as it sounds, right, this is risk that we have not seen. We don't know what they are. And this happens on every flight, right? There's always something that we didn't see. It really is just to the degree of how dangerous is this risk, how much will this affect our flight. Sometimes these unidentified risks can be identified mid-flight when they happen, right? And so we need to accept and know that there are unidentified risks on every flight. And then we have 2 types of acceptability levels for risk, unacceptable and acceptable, right? It's as it sounds, right? Unacceptable risk is risk that is non-beneficial and should be eliminated. And acceptable risk is risk that we allow to happen, right? Every flight has acceptable risk that we choose to make a go decision on. Unacceptable risk, a great scenario that the book gives is a new airplane in instrument flight rules, right? A new airplane, a new system is already challenge enough. But why place yourself in instrument flight rules when you could go out in a perfectly clear VFR day and have visual reference to objects, right? I won't get too much into the rest of that, but basically you're just putting an extra burden, an extra factor on yourself that's unacceptable, that can very easily be eliminated by just not flying that day. An acceptable risk is just the opposite. It's a flight that can happen with the acceptance of risk, but that risk may even be beneficial, right? I'll get to this later too, but think bringing a student into a crosswind scenario. Students need to grow, and if we never bring a student into a crosswind scenario, they're never going to learn to land on a crosswind. So it's a risk, right? A crosswind is not a standard condition. However, it's something that can be beneficial to our growth of the student. And so that's why acceptable risk is accepted and needed for growth. And then you have residual risk. And residual risk is really just the leftover, right? You can also kind of think of this as the acceptable risk, but this is the leftover risk that is in place in the flight once risk elimination techniques have been applied, right? So this is just the risk that we have to accept, and this is the risk that we choose to move on with when we make a go decision for a flight. Now let's talk about what risk actually is, right? Risk is the percent chance of a hazard happening. And what's a hazard? A hazard is a source of danger that creates an undesired event. We, as pilots, don't want undesired events. We want everything to be exactly as we planned it in the flight, because that's how we plan. We want that, and so hazards are sources of danger that we don't want and we don't plan for. Risk is the percent chance that they happen. Risk is the future impact of a hazard, and so our goal is to eliminate the possibility of hazards occurring through risk management. And then the FAA also defines a safety, which they define as a relative freedom from hazards, which is really just the accepted risk, right? This is acceptable risk. This is what we choose to fly with. They also very heavily highlight that, accept no unnecessary risk and accept risk when the benefit outweighs the cost, which, as I explained, like taking a student up on a day that they may have never experienced before, but will result in growth. Yeah. All right, and then the risk management process is what the FAA defines for a way for all pilots to identify risk, right? And you see this method used in pretty much every single model the FAA puts out, and it comes in 3 steps. It's identify, assess, and then mitigate. And there's a lot of ways to identify risk, right? The biggest way that we do it as pilots with higher hours is just experience. You can walk outside on any given day and probably tell whether you want to fly or not, but that's not the only thing we can do to ensure a safe flight. One tool that a lot of pilots use is the flight risk assessment tool. It's a great way of just writing down every factor, well, not every factor, but many factors that can affect a flight, and laying them all out in front of you, because when you visually look at something, you're more likely to decide, go or no go, right? And so identifying the hazard is the first step of the risk management process. We need to see the risk to assess the risk. And then another big one that the FAA highlights is common sense. I think this falls right under experience. However, we need to recognize that a student has less experience when it comes to making common sense decisions about go, no-go decisions, right? And risks in general. Which is why it's our goal to teach. It's our goal to teach common sense. They don't have the common sense. It's uncommon sense to them. So it's our goal to give them that knowledge through the experience that we transfer. And so that's identifying the hazard, right? And so when you see the hazards to a flight, that's when you can start to look at the risk. What is the percent chance that these hazards that we've identified could happen? Risk is, I would say assessment is probability and severity combined, right? It's the percent chance that something happens, and it also is the severity of, if it were to happen, how much would it impact the flight? So, I already mentioned this and identify, but again, the flight risk assessment tool is a great way of just putting it all down on paper and seeing, is it low, medium, or high risk, right? Many flight schools require them to be done for pre-flight, right? It's a great tool for being able to, choose yourself whether you want to go. And it can even be as simple as a table that just has like low, medium, high, split it down, and then you like, it's as simple as just doing impact versus probability, right? And you could pick, 40 knot winds. 40 knots of wind is something that, it's probable because it's gusting outside, and it's likely to cause, this should be the other way around. It's likely to cause undesirable hazards that could impact your flight, right? So it's as simple as making just a, Punnett square looking flight risk assessment tool, right? And the best part about them is that when you look at it on the ground, you're more likely to say no if it's something that you don't agree with. Kind of the same idea with a personal minimum sheet, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And we'll talk about that later. And then the last step is mitigating the risk, right? Putting everything down on paper, we have a mission to fly, right? We can't just put it all down on paper and say, well, looks like we're not going today. If it's bad, maybe, but there's ways for us to eliminate aspects of risk that can make the flight safer, and it might lead us to a go decision, right? And that might just simply be acknowledging the risk, right? If I just look at the risk and I know it's there and I know it's present, I'm more aware of it, I'm going to do things to counteract it. That is great for low level risks with low percentage and low impact. But, as you get higher up, not going is basically the greatest risk management tool. There's a great IFR video by Gary Reeves where he talks about picking an alternate before bad weather has never got anyone killed. It's like the best saying for this, right? If not flying into bad weather, mitigating the risk of bad weather is the best scenario for eliminating it because there's no risk, right? And the other thought that the book provides is if you can afford to fly your own plane somewhere, then you can afford to book an airline ticket to safely get you there. And then, of course, at the end of the mitigation process, the payoff for completing it is either no going and keeping your life, or you get to go and you're happy that you've assessed the risk and you feel that the weather is, and not just weather, but that all conditions are good enough to fly, right? So the payoff of going through risk mitigation is that sometimes you win. Oh, and then the other acronym I like to use for the flight risk assessment tool is like the stable call out in, not acronym, but the relation is that it's the stable call out in flight, right? You're on short final and you say stable, it might make you do a second guess of, am I really stable? Should I go around, right? So that's kind of how I like to visualize it. It's just a tool on the ground versus something when you're in the air. Another good risk assessment tool that we've all heard and have drilled into our brains a million times is the PAVE checklist, which of course is something that you should be introducing to your students as soon as possible, right? PAVE, I'm not gonna go through it super heavy, but right, pilot, I'm safe checklist, boom. That's all you need to do. And when it comes to the I'm safe checklist, the quick tangent from PAVE, this should be something that's introduced day one, right? You want to get to the point where the student does it themselves before every flight. The more the student is assessing themselves, the more they are already thinking about, single pilot resource management. They already have those thoughts in their head of, is this flight safe? Should I go? So that's something you want to drill early. Also add that extra E on there for eating. I don't know why no one ever puts it in there, but it's I'm safe with 2 E's for eating. And then you get to PAVE aircraft, right? This is something that's built in the student over time as you fly, as you pre-flight, as they ask questions. And then it also, I just like to think about this as your aero and aviates and parts of NW craft, just easy acronyms, right? And then a big thing for CFIs is, are you familiar with the airplane? you can be asked to teach in a 172 for 1,000 hours of your life, and then you might have someone come up to you and be like, hey, can you help me fly this Beechcraft Bonanza? You know, those things are super powerful machines, and you might not be used to it. So we also have to keep a check with ourselves that even though we have a ton of hours, it might not be worth it to get in that airplane without prior training, right? So there's that thought too. And then we have the environment. This is a big one. Obviously, this is the weather, but also performance. A lot of people don't think of the environment of PAVE as being in performance. We need to be very aware of what our aircraft can do on a given day. You know, I've done all my training in places that get density altitude up to 10,000 in the summer. We really need to consider, is a touch and go possible on a 7,000 foot runway, right? So that's a big one. Another one is making sure that the student and yourself are appropriately dressed and prepared for the flight, right? If you're staying in a local pattern, you might not feel the need to carry food or something in your flight bag. I always do anyway, but you know, but if you're going on a long cross country, the student needs to be aware that they should dress and prepare appropriately in the event that something goes wrong. That's that planning for emergencies versus planning for success. And that's a big one that I think is really important for the environment side of things. And then of course, being aware of the airport environment and airspace as a CFI is something that we need to be, you know, on top of at all times. So there's that. And then of course, external pressures, which often gets overlooked, I think, in PAVE because people will just try and put it on the I'm safe checklist for like yeah, people just try and push it to I'm safe, right? Stress. And that doesn't do it, right? We have the big idea of operational pitfalls. As we get more experienced as pilots, we want to meet deadlines. We want to get more students through. We want to make them fly more. Oh, the weather is fine. We can make it. But that's not something that we can always do and can get really dangerous for the student because, again, safety is our top priority. And the other big issue that especially the book highlights is that external pressures is the most important part of PAVE because it can cause ignorance of all the other factors. Right? If the weather might be really bad that day and your plane might not be airworthy and you might have forgotten to eat yesterday, but you have to meet that deadline. And so you can completely ignore the PAV and just, you know, external pressures. I got to get there. And so that's kind of, you know, we kind of talked about that with risk mitigation, but you really got to make sure that you're being aware of the deadlines and everything you have to meet. Yeah. Another big one that the book outlines is the 3P method, which honestly I've never been introduced to in my pilot training until I actually opened this book up, right? But a great way to think about it is it's just the risk management process, right? It's 3 steps to perceiving, you know, I guess it's the risk management process more generalized for aeronautical decision making. That's what I would say. I'll just use this honestly. Identify, which is the first P, perceive, right? You see the hazard, you see the risk in flight, and then you have to identify what it does for your flight, which is the assess part. So you perceive the risk, we'll say, you identify how it could affect you, and then you perform, which in this case, I guess would be mitigate. You perform to reduce the risk, right? I'm not a big fan of this. I don't think this is something that I would really take into consideration, but if it works for you, it works for you. And I'm all for promoting anything that works for a certain person, right? Let's see. Next we have self-assessment, and that's beyond just the I'm safe stuff. Excuse me. It dives pretty far into personal minimums. I was never introduced, when I was going through my private pilot training, I was never introduced to personal minimums until my flight instructor told me I should probably do it for my check ride. That's not how it should be, right? We need to have a good general idea of what our students are feeling at the time and what they are comfortable with. It's not something that they should just start thinking about at check ride because it's something that they need to talk about on the check ride. So there's that thought. I like to define personal minimums as your worst experience with acceptable risk. You want to give yourself personal minimums that you have flown in before, but also that if you saw outside, you'd be like, okay, I've done that before, I've trained in it, and I feel comfortable making the choice, this is acceptable risk. However, you can expand your personal minimums by flying with someone, a more experienced pilot, that has those higher minimums, that has that higher acceptable risk level, and that can get you there. That's how I like to think of personal minimums. And you can just think about the student side of things. They come in with 0 personal minimums. Everything is 0. And as you fly with them, they get more comfortable with themselves. They get more comfortable with crosswind, weather conditions, and that pushes their boundaries. We want to be that more experienced, instructor that pushes personal minimums for students, right? Yeah, that's my thought on personal minimums. A big one for us and students that we need to teach is situational awareness. This, explained so simply, is the understanding of everything that's going on around you at all times. This looks like dawn fixation on instruments, and this looks like the use of aeronautical decision making at all times. This is something that needs to be taught to the student early, if they're not already displaying it, right? A lot of people can come in with a natural sense of situational awareness. Great. But some people might not. And we need to show them that they can use all their resources whenever they need it, however they need it, to get the solution to problems that might occur in flight. The big thing that's focused on a lot, though, is obstacles that prevent situational awareness. There's a big, we'll call it 4. There's a big 4 that can really mitigate your ability to have good situational awareness. Is that all in? Okay, sweet. And throw it out here. Sweet. All right, let's talk about fatigue. So there's a few different types of fatigue. There's sleeping fatigue and there's decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is not mentioned in the book, but I think it's a very important type of fatigue, right? It's something that I'm sure you remember after your first few flights, you went home and you went straight to bed, right? It's flying for 2 hours is more tiring than anything else. And the way I think about it is that every student starts with a bank. It's like a battery, right, in your phone. You have a certain amount of decisions that you can make before you effectively lose the decision to make, or you lose the ability to make good decisions. That's how I think of decision fatigue. After a 6-hour flight, you're going to be making way worse decisions than you were at takeoff when it comes to the landing, which is why, well, I won't get into that. But decision fatigue, that is a major type of fatigue that I never hear talked about that I think is very important. And then, of course, you have normal fatigue, right? Sleeping. This is a big one that we need to be careful of as instructors. There's a lot of signs that can alert instructors to, like warning signs, and then we also have to be aware of it because, instructors can work really long days, right? So there's that. The book also highlights that it might not be noticed during pre-flight, which is true because the student is generally more engaged in looking around the aircraft and learning. And then once they get in the plane, the noises, the vibrations, the altitude, it can all worsen fatigue. So we need to be careful of that. There's a lot of good images in the book, or I should say figures, that highlight like warning signs, which is like, eyes going in and out of focus, head bobbing, yawning, that sort of stuff. And then it also highlights countermeasures, which are like naps, high protein meals, that sort of stuff, drinking fluid, controlling temperature. So we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of how to mitigate it in the student. And yeah, because fatigue is just a natural response. We can't push someone to overcome fatigue. So just making sure that the student is with us and able to make and maintain situational awareness by not being tired is very important. So I'll throw that out there. All right, now let's get to stress. Stress is all right. Everyone has stress, right? It's okay to be stressed. And stress is not always bad. It's just the demand. It's the body's response to demands placed upon it, right? And some stress is good because some stress can heighten your senses. I'm sure that everyone can think of examples of when them being stressed out might have made them a little bit better of a more alert of a person, right? And alert is better situational awareness. However, compounding stress can be really, really bad for you. Not only can it impact your performance in the cockpit, but it can also impact your just general health as a pilot, right? You can blood clotting and heart issues, right? So we need to have ways to mitigate stress. There are 3 types of stress. You have physical, which is in the moment stress, and that can be environment, temperature, noise. It's right where you are at the time. This is non-long lasting. It's in the moment, right? Physical. I'll just do that. And then you have physiological, which is in the body. So that could look like fatigue. It could look like missed meals leading to low blood pressure. That could look like, you came in sick and wanted to fly even though, you ignored the I'm safe checklist, right? And so that's physiological, in the body stress. And then you have psychological, which is in the mind. This is what I would consider to be the most dangerous type of stress when it comes to situational awareness, because this can be long-lasting and heavily impacting. Think about, a divorce of parents, loss of a loved one, the loss of an animal. This is a big one that can affect the way students learn over a long period of time. And we also have to be aware of this ourselves, right? It's not just looking at our students, making sure that they are, fit to fly that day. It's also ourselves, right? If you work a 12-hour day, maybe consider sleeping in the next one and, recovering, right? And we have to remember stress is compounding, right? So you can have physiological, physical, and psychological all at once. And at that point, can you even focus? So we need to be aware of that. And then, of course, this is all like a self-assessment of fitness to fly. And then, another big one that the book outlines is fear of lesson content, which is a big one. Not everyone wants to go up in a plane and stall, even though, you want to be a pilot, but you also have to learn to recover from emergencies, right? We need to be able to assure students, or I should say learners, that everything is going to be okay, and that the stress of a maneuver will get better when you do it, right? When you know how to do something, the stress of doing it goes away. So that's another big thing. Next, let's talk about workload overload. This is kind of, we'll say, combined with another thing we're going to talk about later, which is prioritization at work, but I think this belongs in the situational awareness category, right? So a part of workload overload is decision fatigue. We just talked about that. Now, the first sign of workload overload is that the pilot begins to work faster, which in all sense means that you're trying to do 4 things at once. You're trying to pretend that you're an octopus pressing all the buttons at once. You're not. My favorite saying is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, because the smoother you are at doing something, the more items you can get done in a flow, right? So that's that. And there's plenty of ways to combat workload overload. Your instrument flight rules, boom, delay vectors, perfect. You can just take a breather, move on, all good. And then, even if you're VFR, you can just remain outside airspace. Nobody cares what you're doing if you're just gonna do a nice, 30 degrees of bank, do some circles, perfect. Set up, get ready to go, get your checklist done, shoot it down to the ground, right? And then you have task saturation, right? The more task saturated you are, the worse you're going to prioritize tasks. And this is kind of the same thing, right? Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And this just means that decisions might be incomplete, right? Not everything is fully thought out, because you're just trying to go task, and that's by, that's you can fix that by giving yourself those outs of, I need to take a break. Let me go do a left 360 for 3 turns, right? Now, there is a level of teaching involved in this that needs to happen, right? We, as instructors, should gradually increase the workload while the instructor monitors. It is important for a student to be able to recognize they are overloaded, because if they cannot recognize when they are overloaded, if it happens in real life, they won't know what to do. And so you need to basically make an environment where you create work in a safe environment that you can monitor and give feedback on. This could even look like teaching the student to be able to recognize it and delegate the task, right? Maybe you say, I'm a passenger, and then they can tell you, run this checklist, right? It's making that student realize that they have so many options in the cockpit for delegating tasks. We'll get a little more into that later. And then you have complacency. Here, hold on, I'll note workload overload. Okay, and then complacency. This is not something that we have to worry about in a 5-hour student, right? If we're sending out someone to solo, complacency might not be something that we really need to worry about right now. However, it's more something for ourselves, right? It's defined as an overconfidence from repeated experiences of a task, of a very specific task. Obvious examples, checklists. You do a checklist 1,000 times, and I guess this is something that could be brought up by a student, right? Why do we need to do a checklist, right? If I can memorize it all and do it right every time, why do I need a checklist? The best way to do that is just remind them that everyone uses checklists. People with 20,000 hours use checklists. And as you get into bigger, more complex aircraft, you need to know how to be able to run a ton of line items within a short period of time. And the best way to do that is checklists. So basically just reminding students that at all levels, of all skill levels, checklists are used. A big time to be alert when it comes to complacency is maybe you receive a student with 120 hours, right? We need to be more alert for complacency. Maybe that's actually what's holding them back, is that they are too reliant on their own skills that may actually be leading them astray, right? So learners with significant flight experience can be a trouble area. And then another big one is just asking the student questions, right? Maybe you're in flight, maybe you just want to, who's on the downwind? Is there anyone turning base right now? Just making sure that they're aware of their surroundings and that this is not just like another routine task for them is a big one, right? Spatial awareness is, hand in hand with situational awareness because it's pretty much the same thing. So, yeah, that's just a good way to keep students engaged, right? Alrighty. And that's situational awareness. Basically, there's a lot of things that can break it, and we need to teach it. And we'll get into how to teach it right now. Real quick, operational pitfalls. We pretty much talked about that earlier. Yeah, I won't touch on that again. All right, single pilot resource management, right? If we're teaching a private student, we have to teach them to be that single pilot for when they first solo, for when they do their solo cross countries, right? So that's a big thing. And it pretty much is, it's just situational awareness tied into how the student uses their resources. So it's knowing when and how to use everything in the cockpit. Boom, right? The FAA recommends a 5P check. Right, what does that mean? The 5P check is something that they recommend running hourly before, during, and after, we'll say after landing. And that just looks like the plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the programming. I don't think it's a bad idea. It's not something that I've ever actually done and been taught to do, but I think it's a great way to just at least remind yourself to do a check of everything, right? Review everything in your head to plan ahead for what you're going to do next, right? The single pilot resource management, maybe you're pretending to be a passenger in this scenario for your student, right? You need to make sure that your student has a plan. We'll say it's a cross country, right? Your plan, we're doing checkpoints, we're going place to place. We're in the plane, right? We need to make sure that everything in the plane is good. Maybe our engine temperatures are good, our fuel's good, everything looks normal. The pilot, make sure you feel fine. Run a self-assessment on yourself mid-flight, because that's important. We need to make sure that we as pilots, even in the middle of our flying, are assessing ourselves. And then passengers, passengers cannot be overstressed as a incredibly great tool, right? If there's someone sitting next to you that doesn't know how to fly a plane, you can still give them plenty of resources to help you. So, maybe that student looks over at you as the student, or as the passenger, and hands you a checklist. They tell you to, look for something on a map, right? There's plenty of things you can give your passengers, and this is something that we should be teaching students to use as a resource. And then programming is the last P. The only note for programming is that if you have like a really complicated system, say G1000, if you program it incorrectly, you're just going to increase your workload. So you need to make sure that that's something that's set on the ground, so you don't really have to mess with it that much in the flight. Another big thing to highlight in the book is information management, right? Private pilot is considered the hardest rating for the reason of you basically just shove a ton of information at a student in a short amount of time and they have to learn it. It's way overwhelming, right? We all remember it. And a great way to aid that is scenario-based training, which we'll talk about later. But that's just a quick note that the book makes, is that it's a lot for the student, and that we need to recognize that and be able to help them where we can. Aeronautical decision making. This is something that needs to be taught to second nature, right? This is something that if the student is thinking about making a timely decision and they have to think about, maybe we should do this, it's already too late. Second nature, right? Instinct. You're only as good as your best training. We are the training. 80% of aviation accidents are human factor, and so aeronautical decision making, by improving this, we can improve the chances, well, we'll say improve the training of the student, right? Obviously, aeronautical decision making, it's everything we do. It starts on the ground. It starts as the risk management process, right? As I said, hesitation is already the wrong decision. And we also need to reinforce the fact in the student that declaring emergency is always an option and always appropriate if they deem it to be, right? Nobody cares about the paperwork if you're not allowed to do the paperwork. We need to really reinforce that. I'm not going to go over it a ton. The book doesn't either. But I strongly recommend Advisory Circular 6022. It's a great resource for aeronautical decision making, and the book goes through a process for decision making. I don't like this because I don't think I should sit in a plane and make decisions by sitting there and thinking about them, right? I'm just going to make the decision based off my experience and my training. It's very similar to the risk management process in 3Ps. It's just incredibly generalized, right? You recognize it, you diagnose the problem, and think about the best course of action, and then you implement the best course of action. It has a scenario. The book has a scenario that it goes through to teach it, and basically the good part about it is that it highlights that every decision you make affects 3 more things later down the line. You just need to be aware of the domino effect, and that's just staying ahead of the airplane, right? We need to be aware of that. If we turn around, maybe for bad weather, to go back to our original airport, we just changed the amount of fuel we're using. We need to be aware of that, right? And that's something that we need to shock or communicate to the student, that they need to be aware that when every time they make a decision, another factor changes. That's what happens when you have 3 dimensions of movement instead of 2. A big disruptor of aeronautical decision making is hazardous attitudes. We all hear about these. They should be told to the student, right? They need to be able to recognize their own hazardous attitudes, but also we need to be able to recognize their hazardous attitudes. Yeah, pretty much that's it, right? It affects their willingness to learn. If a learner has an easy time flight training, they might develop a hazardous attitude, right? If you're a really good pilot, if they have really good stick and rudder skills, they might get a feeling of invulnerability, right? You know, it's good to hype your student up and you know, get them feeling like they're all that, but the second that they get to a point where they feel like nothing will happen to them, they will let something happen to them, and we need to be aware of that when we teach. And we also need to teach how for them to recognize antidotes. Let's talk about resources, right? This is pretty much also just single pilot research management and aeronautical decision making, but there's a lot of resources everywhere. It's a lot for the student too, especially if you're, you know, training in a technically advanced airplane. There's so many possible things that we can use, and the student needs to know them, right? I'll go through and write them out. All right, we have 3 types of resources. I'm sorry, never mind, we have 2 types of resources. We have internal. It's pretty simple. It's in the plane, right? It's what we're looking at on the screens. It's what we're looking at in our hands. It's what we have in our brain, honestly. And that can look like automation management, knowing how to program your FMS, knowing how to, read a map, right? Read a sectional chart. And then, passengers. We talked about that too, but giving your passenger tasks, it's in the plane. It's a resource. Everything is a resource. So Yeah, we'll call this in plane. And then you have external, outside the plane. Air traffic control is our greatest resource. Not enough people talk to air traffic control how they should, right? Yes, they're there to increase safety of the airspace and all that stuff, but they're here for us as pilots. And if we can teach students to utilize ATC as much as possible, then it makes them a safer pilot. And familiarity is important, right? When I got my private, I went to 3 towered airports over my whole time, and I think I maybe got 3 hours of towered airport experience. It wasn't anything. I can't say that I had a bad experience getting my private because at the time of my life, but maybe I wasn't exposed to enough, right? They're great in emergency situations, you know, it's familiarity, right? I'll also strongly say that the flight service stations are completely underutilized. Nobody even knows they exist nowadays. They can tell us everything, right? You want to know weather anywhere? Awesome, they'll brief you on it, right? I have not used them more than 5 times, and I know they're underutilized, but I just haven't had the chance to. We need to teach the importance of using all of our resources outside of the plane. And then, you know, at the end of the day, the learner should be asked to identify resources while we're teaching, while we're flying. You know, show me what resources you have that could fix X problem. Give them a scenario, right? So identify issues, identify solutions, that sort of thing. That is external. I'll go ahead and note that. We'll keep it there. And then we have workload management, which goes hand in hand with workload overload. But instead of getting overloaded, we should teach our students to manage their workload correctly. This I found is especially important for instrument training, but of course, you know, every pilot needs to be able to prioritize tasks, right? Sequencing events is important. We have to stay ahead of the aircraft, and this is as simple as just demonstrating that when you're in a go-around, when you're in a go-around, you prioritize the power over telling ATC you're going around, right? It's as simple as that. We have tasks, they're sequenced, and they have to be prioritized. Another thing is that we as CFIs can prompt students for high workload moments. That just looks like, you know, entering the pattern, right? We want to have checklists done. We want to get the weather. We want to brief our entry. We have to talk to ATC if it's a towered airport, right, to enter the airspace. It's all of this, right? And as a private student, maybe you're not looking for, you know, a brief on everything, but you still want to make sure that they know that they have the opportunity to get task saturated and they need to use their resources when available. And then I like to think that commercial applicants should also be able to describe how they're going to do maneuvers as well, right? I think that they should be able to talk all the time about every single thing they're doing, right? You know, you're doing a short field landing. Well, I want you to be able to describe what's your aiming point, what your touchdown point's going to be, how you're going to do it, what your airspeed's going to be, what your gust factor is, how far apart your aiming point and your landing distance are going to be, and how you're going to perform the maneuver. I want all of that because you're a commercial applicant. You should be able to do that. And then, I mean, that's pretty much it, right? Just avoiding task saturation and not getting overloaded. Yeah, okay, that wraps up resources. Let's talk about decision-making skills. A lot of older instructors only really care about stick and rudder skills. You know, that's just, can you fly the airplane? Can you manage the stuff in the airplane? That's it, right? But they also carry this idea that safety detracts or I should say that risk management and aeronautical decision making being introduced to lower level students actually detracts from the training. And while directly talking to a student about, you know, telling a student what ADM is not going to help them, especially if they're low hours. However, teaching it through use of scenarios is what our goal is, right? Safe training and learning is described in the book as having 3 phases. Let's go through them. Phase 1. Think of this as like your private student with 15 hours. This is stick and rudder, right? We have to build the base of the pyramid. Pardon my pyramid. This is stick and rudder. We have to start here. Right? Think back to your first solo, at least mine and people I've talked to. When you did your first solo, you didn't know what anything meant, you know? I just knew how to land the plane, and I felt great about it, right? Because my instructor taught me to fly. He didn't teach me everything I need to know yet, but he taught me to fly, and he taught me to make safe decisions. Confidence is necessary to give to your student for this step. And this is as simple as just being able to do any type of landing correctly. Like even for like a commercial student, right? You need to build their short field landing and their crosswind landings correctly before you can start implementing scenarios into them, right? And so that brings us to phase 2. It's light scenario-based training and risk management training. This is where the learner knows how to make a safe choice and identify the hazards along with the choice that they've made, right? And phase 2 can just look like a ground scenario, right? Maybe you're sitting with them at a desk and you give them a light scenario about when they might want to use a certain type of landing. We'll say short field, right? Or for private, this might just look like asking them the night before, hey, how does the weather look tomorrow, right? This gives them a scenario, whether real or fake, to look at. And then think about like a short field landing, right? Instead of just having the stick and rudder skills, maybe the runway is wet, you know, maybe in the scenario, your flaps are up, right? So there's just that sort of thing. Maybe thinking about how they would do a projected landing at a high altitude versus a low altitude, stuff like that. And then phase 3 is complex in-flight scenarios. So you take everything that we've discussed for phase 1 and 2 and basically turn them into something in flight. I think these are best on a cross country because it gives you more variables to work with, right? And you give them a realistic distraction. Boom, your passenger's sick. You have 2 airports in front of you. One has a short runway, 1,800 feet, and one has a long runway, but it's further, right? What are they gonna do? And you let them choose. The safety of the flight is tested. Obviously, not the real safety, but the safety of the scenario flight is tested. And you let them make the choices they want. We'll get into scenario-based training, but that's the general idea of it, right? And so giving them more advanced scenarios will help improve their decision-making skills, right? And that's how we can do it without directly just talking to them about ADM and risk management, right? We have to assess them and we can help them grow by teaching them to make better decisions. All right, and then let's get into scenario-based training. This is probably the biggest part of this chapter. I would argue that it also has the biggest impact on how a student learns, right? Okay, So as discussed, it helps the instructor effectively teach risk management and aeronautical decision making. And the goal of the instructor is to be able to turn all of the planning for a flight over to the student as fast as they can. Students complain about it all the time. I complain about it all the time, like, oh man, I have to plan everything. But it's the goal, right? Because it's as the student is going through the process of looking at the weather, looking at the weight balance, performance calculations, they see the safety of flight before them and they can effectively make a decision, right? They're going to do it for the rest of their life. They might as well start early. And obviously, it's still the job of the CFI to be a mentor, to demonstrate everything, to correct when needed, but it's important for the student to be able to make those decisions as soon as they can. So for scenario-based training to be effective, a lot of things have to be established, right? Before you start flying, I should say. On the ground, you want to tell the student, right? There's a scenario. Maybe you want to talk to them about the fact that the scenario can change, right? You want to let them know that things will change during the scenario, and it's okay for them to make whatever choices they feel necessary. And then you also want to establish the outcomes, like desired learning outcomes, and the desired level of performance, right? What you want to see from the student. So those need to be established before. And then as an instructor, there's a lot of key things that we need to remember that makes a good scenario. Biggest thing is it's not a test. It's never a test, right? We are pushing their decision-making skills we'll say they're pushing we're pushing their skills to see what choices they make to make sure that they have a full grasp on aeronautical decision making. But there's not one correct answer. It's not obvious. It's not an obvious answer. It's okay for them to make a lot of different things. And then we need to make it interactive, right? They can interact with us. We can interact with their environment. It's not, you give them the scenario, you sit back in your chair and you watch. No, that's not it, right? And we don't want it to promote errors in the way they fly. We don't want to make it dangerous or promote dangerous activities. And then, right. And then we want it to be time pressured. That's the whole point of giving an ill passenger or something. We need to make it so that the student feels pressured to make a choice that engages that aeronautical decision making. And as realistic as possible, right? It's not going to matter if it's not realistic, right? You can't tell them like, oh, the floor is lava everywhere and you have to land here, right? We want it to be something that they could experience in a real flight to train them. That's our job. And then, of course, not of course, but finally, it engages all three learning domains. That's cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Cognitive being mental. That's the decisions they make, right? Affective being feeling, not what they are feeling in their, their hands, right? But their feelings for the passengers, that sick passenger in the back on board. Oh, we really have to get down to the ground as fast as we can, right? And then psychomotor, which is the physical, right? Not physical of what their body's doing, but physical choices that they make, such as, oh, I'll divert to the shorter field because I trust my physical skill to do a short field landing. That's physical. Okay. Yeah, perfect. So that's what a good scenario-based training looks like, right? Of course, that learners should be taught to brief possible emergencies for the flight. That's why we have a pre-takeoff brief. But, even on a cross-country flight, we should be encouraging learners to think about what could go wrong. Maybe that's picking an alternate, even if you're a day VFR flight with perfect weather. Something like that. And then we need to give the student room to make poor choices, because if they don't make a poor choice, they won't know the right choice. This doesn't mean unsafe, but it just means that it can be a poor choice fit to the student's skill level, and it would result in a positive outcome, even if that's a positive outcome in a debrief. Safe and correct decisions, progress learning. Another thing that is heavily emphasized is that decision making is in every single ACS. Every ACS has a line item about decision making, because we need to be able to decide to do things really fast, and if they're not correct, it can change safety of flight. And then finally, we talk about assessing single pilot resource management skills. How can we as instructors assess how our students handle single pilot resource management, right? We need to assess how the learner arrives at a decision. Was risk appropriately assessed? What resources were used? And was the risk correct, right? And by allowing, even simple decisions can help the flight instructor assess risk, right? That's the no-go decision in the morning. That's the, let's fill up to full even though we're at 30 gallons of fuel, right? It's just simple things like that. Obviously, scenario-based training is a great way of assessing this. And then single pilot resource management grading, right? There's 4 components of it. Okay, so there's 4 ways to grade it, right? Explanation. This means that the learner can describe the risk, right? This is recognition of risk. Practice, right? Did they actually apply the principles to the flight? So we'll say, application. And you have the manage and decide, right? Did the learner use all the resources in the flight? And this might get to the point where the instructor is not even needed, right? This could be instructor helps. This could be the instructor helping, but the managed side of things could be, we'll say all. This could be we'll say instructor silent, right? And then you of course have what was not observed by the student. It's overlooked, right? Stuff that was overlooked by the student. Equally as important. And then, of course, post-flight debriefings where you brief this stuff, right? And that doesn't just look like you sitting at a desk talking at the student the whole time. You want a collaborative assessment. It's talked about later in the book, but you want a collaborative assessment of how your flight went. The student should go first, right? They should know how they did during the flight, and they should know how they want to improve, and you can guide that conversation by going after them, right? Or helping them along in that debriefing. I also firmly believe in taking notes during a flight. I never want to have a moment where I'm just sitting there because they're paying me, right? So yeah, every flight, the learner should get a new level of knowledge, benefited by a debrief from the instructor and the student. And then also, you should always leave the student with the next lesson, with the content of the next lesson, to help them plan appropriately and start making those risk management and aeronautical decision making steps early.
because it's going to help them plan the flight better. It's going to help you assess better as an instructor, and things are just going to go better, right? All right, that's everything for Chapter 1 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. Thank you.